It was only a very short-lived CPU reign by AMD. Intel's response didn't take long, so both the 13900K and 7950X deliver us an outstanding CPU battle. In today's test, the Intel Core i9 13900K based on a Raptor Lake and coming equipped with 24 cores and 32 threads in total. It takes up the fight against AMD's current flagship, the Ryzen 9 7950X. While the 13900K does incredibly well in many aspects, there's also a catastrophic downside to it. It must be said, though, that both AMD as well as Intel have their pros and cons in all the tests that are about to follow, and so there's no real answer as to which CPU truly is the better one at the end of the day. There simply are several factors we need to be aware of. What those are, you'll find out in today's video, starting with the price. The 13900K's MSRP is at $589 and in November 2022, we're looking at retail pricing of $640 to $670. The competitor's counterpart, the Ryzen 9 7950X, at the time of video production, goes for $610 to $710. It should be noted, though, that pricing varies in recent times. I'd also like to point out that all these CPUs I've paid for out of my own pocket. Still, I'd like to give a shout out to Yarios over at the online shop Equipper and thank him for getting a hold of all that stuff for me. Hashtag not sponsored. Architecture. As it was the case with Alder Lake, Intel still makes use of their 10nm manufacturing process, which they now renamed to Intel 7. As with the previous generation, Raptor Lake 2 does make use of a hybrid architecture. The CPU, therefore, is equipped with a mix of performance as well as efficiency cores, for short, P and E cores. As you know, only P cores support hyper-threading. So while in the case of the 13900K, we are graced with a total of 24 cores, only 8 of them are P cores, which also happen to clock higher than E cores do. Raptor Lake processors, luckily, are backwards compatible with 600 series motherboards such as Z690. A 700 series chipset such as Z790 therefore is not a necessity. But you should keep in mind that a BIOS update will be required on 600 series boards in order for 13th gen CPUs to be able to run on them. Other than with AMD's new AM5 platform, Intel still allows and supports DDR4, so those of you on a budget could make a cheaper entry into the LJ1700 platform. But by going with DDR4 instead of DDR5, you will lose out on a bit of CPU performance. Test setup. The 13900K I'm putting into the socket found on the premium ASRock Z790 Taichi motherboard. With that specific board, I've also done some adjustments and fine-tuning for the new Intel CPU generation. We'll soon get back to that. For the memory, I've once again gone with the trusty Kingston Fury Beast RGB DDR5 RAM with 32GB and 6000 MHz, along with CL36 timings. Now, since both the latest AMD and Intel CPUs tend to get pretty toasty, for the cooler, I've gone with the Be Quiet PureLoop 2 FX 360mm AIO liquid cooler. And to take care of the majority of GPU bottlenecks, I'm once again making use of my ASUS RTX 3090 TUF Gaming OC graphics card. Optimization and clock speeds. First of all, I'd like to discuss the following question. What exactly are and can be considered stock settings? Maybe those that are automatically set for us by the motherboard after having installed the CPU, or maybe those that Intel officially specifies. Depending on the motherboard and its manufacturer, you will come across some deviations. In the case of my ASRock Z790 Taichi, the CPU at auto settings is allowed to draw more power than specified by Intel, thus allowing the CPU to perform better, but in turn makes the temperatures skyrocket to the maximum, a side effect being higher power consumption. So I've put the extra time and work into running the i9 13900K in 2 different configurations for all my tests. That's stock settings dictated by the motherboard and stock settings with a forced power limit according to the official Intel specification. meaning I've limited the 13900K's power limit to 253 watts. Does that maybe have an impact on clock speed behavior? At auto settings at full load, for the P cores we are initially seeing 5.2 to 5.3 GHz. The clock speed of those 16 E cores, on the other hand, is at 4.1 GHz. As a matter of fact, by enforcing that 253 watt power limit, the clock speeds do drop noticeably. For the P cores, we now read out 4.7 GHz on average and 3.9 to 4 GHz for the E cores. The max achievable boost clock, on the other hand, remains identical for both configurations, that being a 5.8 GHz boost for P cores and 4.3 GHz for E cores. That's all within Intel's official spec. Luckily, it quickly becomes obvious that clock speed behavior in games between these two configurations practically is identical, so it's safe to assume we'll see more of a difference in multi-core workloads than in gaming. How well the 13900K stacks up against all those other CPUs, and especially against its direct competitor, 7950X by AMD, we'll now find out. Performance, productivity. Starting with the Cinebench R23 test, we see the 13900K at auto settings taking the #1 spot, but it's closely followed by AMD's 7950X. With the 253 watt limit enforced, the i9 lags behind by about 1000 points compared to the AMD flagship model. However, Intel does score with a significantly higher single-core performance. Moving on to the 7-zip benchmark, AMD traditionally positions itself at the top end. While the 13900K is offering outstanding performance here too, it still is about 8% behind the 7950X. In the V-Ray 5 benchmark, AMD is still clinging to the top and manages an almost 10% lead over Intel. We're even talking of 17% when referencing the results with the power limit in place. In the following rendering test Corona benchmark, Intel and AMD deliver a neck-and-neck race. We're talking of a tie. In the fairly demanding rendering test Blender, the 7950X takes the crown and leads by a whopping 7% or even more. It's pretty obvious that AMD's 16 high-performance cores have an advantage over Intel's hybrid core layout here. Things take a positive turn for Intel in the handbrake rendering test, albeit the 7950X is still dangerously close to the 13900K here. In the video rendering test Vegas Pro 20, AMD takes the lead again, but we're not necessarily talking of a big difference to Intel here, even though when limiting the 13900K to its 253 watts, we do actually lose out on valuable rendering speed. Gaming. In the 3D Mark Time Spy test, Intel, as so often, sees great gains over AMD. However, I highly dislike benchmarking with this tool, since it always seems to be favoring Intel CPUs. Even a 12900K of the previous generation seems to be doing slightly better than a more recent 13900K, so I don't take these results too seriously. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we for the first time see Intel's clear advantage with their higher single-core performance, although it needs to be said that the 13900K only takes the crown due to its high clock speeds here. The 253 watt configuration performed equally as well as the 7950X. A very obvious win for Intel can be witnessed in the game Borderlands 3. The 13900K performs almost 7% better than a 7950X, and that's a pretty big difference. Similar story in Cyberpunk 2077. The 7950X drops behind its Intel counterpart. The i9 is over 6% faster. Traditionally for Far Cry, even in its latest 6th title, it has a strong bias for Intel CPUs. AMD delivers great frame rates, but in the most extreme case is put to shame by Intel by a whopping 15%. AMD does have a bit of a revenge moment in the racing game Forza Horizon 5 though. This is where AMD's two models, 7900X and 7950X, lead the pack, although the 13900K is very close to AMD here. And the by now fairly ancient GTA 5 halfway modern CPUs more or less deliver the same amount of performance. You do score slightly higher minimum FPS with the 13900K however. we see newly gained strengths on AMD's side in the title Horizon Zero Dawn. Here AMD leads by almost 5%, even though both CPU giants do shockingly well here. In the title Metro Exodus, Intel appears to be the faster one, with a lead of almost 6%. And that streak seems to carry over to the game Red Dead Redemption 2. Here a 7950X performs even worse than a 12900K. Therefore, the gap to the new 13900K is growing even bigger, since Intel managed to further increase performance over the 12900K here. Intel in this flagship tier is about 15 to 16% faster than AMD. In the slightly dated yet still fairly meaningful title Rise of the Tomb Raider, AMD and Intel are practically the same, but Intel does offer ever so slightly higher minimum FPS. Almost identical results we see in the succeeding title Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Intel with their 13900K is slightly ahead of AMD's 7950X. Realistically speaking, it's more of a tie though. Gaming average FPS. When combining all 11 games tested and calculating the average, the 13900K without a doubt lands the #1 spot, taking roughly a 4% lead over AMD's 7950X. But it should be taken into consideration that both CPUs are so close to each other. At the end of the day, at higher resolutions, such as 4K UHD, there hardly will be any noticeable difference in frame rate. But nonetheless, in theory at least, Intel is taking the #1 spot in gaming. In areas such as rendering and productivity, I would consider AMD as the overall winner. Important things we should factor in surely are power consumption and temperatures. Now, it doesn't matter whether we are talking about the auto settings dictated by the motherboard or the official Intel spec regarding the power limit, the 13900K in the best case scenario consumes 11% more power than a Ryzen 9 7950X does. In the worst case, we are talking over 29%. That's what I tend to call a little excessive and catastrophic for my standards. So for somewhat comparable raw performance, the i9 CPU in my test draws 40 or even up to 110 watts more power from the wall than the already fairly power-hungry 7950X. A noteworthy and very painful downside on the AMD model, however, is the rather unattractive power draw at idle. So which of these two CPUs between the 13900K and 7950X does worse in that regard is up to you really. If we measure the total system's power draw while gaming, there's only 25 to 30 watts separating the two flagships. So while we end up with a slightly lower frame rate with AMD, Ryzen tends to be a little more power efficient. Things are getting a bit more chaotic when comparing the temperatures though. The 13900K at auto settings catapults itself to its max temperature of 100 degrees Celsius in just a matter of a few seconds. That does lead to a drop in clock speed over time. Once we limit the CPU's power down to Intel's specified 253 watts, the CPU temperature drops significantly. We're then looking at a nice 88 degrees without any too serious performance losses. AMD's 7950X, on the other hand, runs at a max of 95 degrees at stock settings and can actually maintain its clock speeds at that temperature. What does bother me with both Intel and AMD is that they both desperately aim for the #1 spot in charts. And that's with very little regard to power limits and voltage that needs to be pumped through those CPUs. With just a few simple tweaks within the BIOS, both the power draw as well as temperatures can be optimized by a lot. Especially with the AMD CPU when making use of PbO2 negative offsets, along with power and temperature limits, there's a lot of efficiency waiting to be gained. The power draw of the 7950X at full load therefore easily can be reduced by a whopping 17%. The temperatures thank you for that. Instead of those 95 degrees, we're then looking at just 78, and all that with barely any loss in performance. Similar story with Intel, albeit we see a bigger performance hit when starting to optimize. Regardless, in my opinion, setting the right power limit for the 13900K is very much worth it. The next only logical step would be to undervolt the i9 processor. Unfortunately, my specific CPU didn't allow itself to be tweaked any further. I mean, I did try to reduce the CPU voltage, but stability quickly was thrown out of the window. I could only regain stability at a very specific voltage point, and that was the voltage I started with in the first place. So it seems I got fairly unlucky. With those lower models i7 13700K and i5 13600K on the other hand, I achieved great results when it comes to optimizations and undervolting. Conclusion. So what are the respective advantages of both the 7950X and 13900K? The Intel CPU is sitting on the overall cheaper platform, but it has pretty much reached the end of its life already. Apparently, future CPUs will no longer be supported by it. AMD's AM5 platform, on the other hand, with current motherboards, is supposed to be supported at least up until 2025. So in the long term, AMD might appear to be the better investment, but you should also consider the here and now, the present. A downside on Intel's side surely is the overall lower amount of available PCIe lanes. For gamers at this point in time, not that big of a deal yet. We see slightly higher raw performance with the 7950X. The 13900K, on the other hand, on average performs a little better in games. AMD tends to consume less power, although Intel is more efficient at idle. The temperatures of both of these CPUs are fairly high, but can be controlled when doing some manual optimization work. At the end of the day, it's a matter of personal preference and price. Both the Ryzen 9 7950X and Core i9 13900K have its pros and cons, but all in all are pretty close in terms of performance. With that said, thank you so much for watching, and until the next one.